Hey guys, welcome to my channel iCode. I'm Pallav and today we are going to build a system for handling analytics in an iOS app. I thought of this as a good use case for discussing system design, and I'm sure that this video is going to be very useful for you while preparing for the interviews, especially hiring manager or system design rounds where you are supposed to build a scalable and a manageable system. So in this video we will see that what should be our thought process, how should we approach when it comes to build a system. We'll see every phase of system design in very detail, right from understanding the problem, requirement gathering, defining of the scope, listing of the technical requirements, limitations, coming up with a high level design and then its implementation. We'll see everything in very detail. I'll be using Fernando Martin's approach for building this system with some of the tweaks that I made, but more importantly, we'll focus on the approach, the thought process, and different phases that are involved in designing a system. So let's get started. For designing a system, the very first thing that comes even before requirement gathering is understanding of the problem. That actually, what do you want to build? What is your problem statement? So in our case, the final goal of our system will be to send events to the servers of the analytics services. We'll send the data to the analytics services, and then after processing, those analytics services will result into the graphs, into the different reports that will be used by product team for analyzing, for coming up with new features, removal of features, and other business decisions. So that is the final goal when we talk about any analytics system. And for us as a mobile app developers, we will be building the system for sending the data to the servers of analytics service providers. That's it. That is the part that we will be focusing on. So now that we are clear with the problem statement, we can move towards gathering the requirement. Now, gathering of requirement is the most crucial and most important phase when it comes to design a system. It is always advised to spend some good amount of time in gathering the requirements. In case of an actual project, circle up with all the stakeholders, discuss different aspects of the feature that you are building, try to think of edge cases, corner cases, list down all the requirements that can come at 11th hour, and specifically for the interview, ask as many questions as possible. When your interviewer gives you a problem statement, try to think around it. Try to come up with as many questions as possible. Take your time, think of the problem, and come up with the questions. More will be the questions, easier will be the problem. Because by asking the questions, you are actually breaking the problem in smaller chunks. You are pulling out the hidden use cases and you are putting everything on your table in front of you. When everything will be there in front of you, it will get really easy to design the system. But if you miss on listing down the requirements, it will bite you back. Because at later point of time, you won't be able to accommodate those requirements. Your system won't be scalable. And that's the whole point of the system design round. So always start by making an exhaustive list of requirements. Let's do the same here. So our first requirement is that our system should be able to send the events to the analytics service providers, to the servers that we discussed. This is something that we have been discussing for last 2 minutes, but still, it's a good practice to jot it down. The next requirement is that our system should be accessible from any part of the application. So what it means is that be it your login screen, your subscription screen, maybe your home screen, your analytics manager should be accessible from each of them. So that's our second requirement. The next requirement is that it should be easy to use. So we should be able to call the method for tracking the event, for sending the event, for logging the events, whatever the name you give. They should be very easy to use, as simple as that analytics manager.log event. That's it. The methods that you would be exposing, they should not be very complex. So that's our third requirement. The next requirement says that you should be able to send multiple events. So of course, it is not just about sending one event. You will be of course sending the login success, login failure, subscription purchased, maybe subscription plans viewed, and a hell amount of other events. So definitely our system should be able to send multiple events. The next requirement says that each event can have multiple parameters. So what it means is that each event will have different parameters. For example, download success. In this case, maybe you want to send the content ID to the analytics services so that the product team can track that this particular content is being downloaded frequently. And in case of download failure, maybe you want to send the error along with that so that it can be analyzed that why download is failing for this content. What is the error? The next requirement says that our system should be able to set and unset the properties of a user. Now, tracking of the user's activity is one part, but another crucial part of an analytics service is that mapping of that activities with the user. So you will have to set the properties of a user when user logs in the system, and when user logs out, you will have to clear the user attributes, user properties, so that those events do not get mapped with that particular user. So that is a very common requirement when it comes to implement the analytics, and so is therefore our system, that our system should be able to set or unset the user properties. The next requirement is that we should be able to support multiple analytics services. What this means is that our system should be able to send data to multiple services like CleverTap, MoEngage, Amplitude, Firebase, or any service provider that your company is using that your product team has asked you to integrate. So that is one of the requirements. The next requirement says that our system should be able to send different events to different analytics services. Now this can happen that product team can ask you to send certain events for CleverTap, which should not be sent to Firebase, let's say, and certain events which should be sent to Firebase, which should not be sent to MoEngage, or some event that should be sent to Amplitude, which should not be sent to any of the others. So the baseline is that our system should be able to send different events to different analytics services. That's a valid point. And the next requirement says that for the same event, event name and parameters can differ for different services. So for example, login success. Now for login success, a different event name would be going for CleverTap, that is login-success, and a different event name will be going for Amplitude, that is login success without hyphen. And same goes for the parameters as well. So some of the parameters can be sent to the first service, but that might not be the case with the other. So that was another requirement. And the next requirement says that system should be scalable. That means that events and parameters can be added or removed easily. So this happens very frequently. That's the whole point of putting analytics. So whenever the product guys ask you to add a feature, they will ask for adding the analytics event for it. And whenever they will be pulling off any feature, they will say that we don't want to track it anymore, so remove that event. So that is a very valid and a very common use case. And the next requirement says that system should be testable. Another question while listing down the requirements can be related to the no network scenarios when user goes offline. So in those cases, whatever activities will be performed by user, are we going to store them and then send to the servers when the network will be available? But well, that is not the case with us because we will be using the third-party SDKs for handling the analytics, and that implementation is already there in those SDKs in those libraries. So we don't need to handle those cases. These were the requirements. Now let's move to the next phase, that is defining the scope. After listing down the requirements, the next phase that comes in is defining the scope. Now in an actual project, after listing down the requirements, you will do effort estimation for estimating the effort for each of the requirement for each of the features. And then you can discuss with the product to descope some of the features depending on the bandwidth that you might take that particular feature, that particular part in the next phase and something in the first phase. So that is about defining the scope. And in case of interviews, you should reiterate all the requirements. You should double check with the interviewers if this is something that they want. And then they can ask you to descope some of the requirements. So basically you will be defining a boundary. The scope and the expectations will be crystal clear. But in our case, we don't want to descope anything. So till now the crux is that we will be building a system that would be able to send events to analytics services. There would be set and unset of the user properties. We would be able to change the event names and parameters for different services, and that would be accessible from any part of the application. So this is the baseline, this is the crux, and now we'll jump to the next phase, that is identification of the technical requirements. In this phase, you are supposed to think of all the technical requirements, of all the technicalities that will be required for implementing the scope that you have just defined. For all the features that you have just listed, what are the technicalities that you will be needing? For example, if there are web service calls involved in that, how will your network layer look like? If you are dealing with the sensitive information, where will you store it? How will you deal with the authentication? If you are using the databases, what kind of databases will you use? Whether they will be SQL or no SQL? How will your database schema look like on a broader level? Not the tiny details. And in brief, you will discuss everything that relates to the technical aspect of your solution. Now at this point, the interviewer might suggest you something that instead of this, you can do this, or they can ask for a clarification, a justification that why are you using NoSQL database instead of a SQL one, and then there can be a bit of discussion over there. So try to incorporate those suggestions, or if you are very sure that whatever you are doing it right, then please make it clear to the interviewers. In case of an actual project, there can be a lot of things about which you want to give a heads up to the stakeholders. For example, integration of Google Maps is involved. Then you might want to highlight this to product that this will be a paid service, you will need the tokens, you will need the keys and other aspects around that. So in most of the cases, this is the last stage where the discussions happen, and after this, the high level design comes. So let's quickly look at the technical requirements for our use case. So the first point was that our system should be accessible from anywhere. Now for this, either we can have an instance of our analytics manager with each of the entity, or we can keep it a singleton. And I understand that most of the people do not like singletons. They avoid using singletons, and even I am one of them. But avoiding singleton every time is not the best way, I believe. So the call to use singletons or not, it depends on how are you using it. So if you are using your singleton for globally storing the data so that it can be accessed from anywhere, it is a bad practice. instead pass the data. Or if different entities in your app can mutate the data that is available with the singleton, it is a bad practice because then the data will be compromised for the other entities. So in these kind of scenarios, don't go with the singleton. But in our case, because we are not mutating any data, we are just passing it to the third-party SDKs, and we need a layer between those third parties and the caller functions. That will be our analytics manager. So I'll prefer to keep it singleton. The next point was that our system should support multiple analytics services. So for this, our manager should have an instance of all those entities. And then there should be a common method which will be called by the caller functions, and that will deal with passing of the data to different SDKs to different libraries. But the method that will be exposing to the caller entities, that will be a single method. The next requirement was that event names or parameters can change for services. So to deal with this, each service should be treated as a separate entity. And because it will be a separate entity, the logic for handling the event name or maybe parameters, changing them, will reside in that entity itself. So the analytics manager, that will be our exposed layer, that won't be polluted with the if and else logics for handling these things, and will be able to keep the things modular. The next requirement was that our system should be testable. And whenever it comes to the testability, the first thing that comes to mind is using the protocol-oriented approach. So we will be using protocols for implementing our system, and we'll make sure that it is testable. In terms of other technical requirements, we don't need a database because that is being handled by the SDKs, the libraries themselves. And we don't need the other network layer or other network logic also, because that is also something that will be handled by the SDKs themselves. So these were some of the technical requirements for us, which were not too much, which were not too technical, but I wanted to highlight this phase of identifying the technical requirements. Because when interviewers will ask you to design a system something similar to maybe Instagram or maybe TikTok, then you will have to think of all those cases about the databases, about the user sensitive information, where you will save it, the way you will deal with the UI, how will you break them, how will you modularize them. So this was an important stage in our approach. Now let's move to the next phase, that is proposing a high level design. As we discussed that we will be having an analytics manager which will be a singleton, so we'll need a shared instance of it. What else will we need? We'll need a method for sending the events in this analytics manager. So there will be a method, something called send event or maybe track event. Now this method should have a parameter for event. So an event will be passed to this method, and then the respective methods of those SDKs, those libraries will be called, and then event will be passed on to them. So we'll need one more entity, that will be event. This entity event will be mainly having two things. One will be the name of that event, and the second will be the parameters associated with it. Apart from that, we'll have a method for setting the attributes of user and then unsetting it when user logs out. So we'll need two more methods for this. And now there's one more thing missing with our analytics manager. You can pause the video and give it a thought. So we discussed that because we want to have support to multiple analytics service providers, our analytics manager should have an instance of each of them. So for that, we will need one more thing, that will be an array or a set maybe, which will be having the instances of those entities. So for that, let's keep a property as services, which will be an array of analytics service. Now what will be this analytics service? We know that it will be one of the third parties, but how will it look in our code? Because we can't keep the structure different for each of the analytics service provider. We can't keep it different for Amplitude, we can't keep it different for CleverTap. So we need a contract, we need to have a common implementation so that it is easy to replace at the time of testing. And for that, we'll need an entity, a protocol I should say, that will be our analytics service. Now once we have our analytics service protocol, it makes sense to move these three methods in that protocol, because these are the methods which will be called for each of the analytics services. So it makes sense to put it in the protocol, and the confirming entity will have to override them. It makes sense. So now our analytics manager will not have all those logics, it will not be that wet, and only these two things will be there in our analytics manager. But we want to call the method of our analytics manager something like analyticsmanager.share.send event, which is actually not having that method. So then it makes sense to make our analytics manager conform to the protocol analytics service. So once this will happen, all those methods which are there in analytics service will be available with the analytics manager too. And then we'll be able to call analyticsmanager.share.send event. So it looks fine till here. But remember that we discussed that we will not be passing all the events to all the services. There can be a specific set of events that will be passed to service X and a specific set that will be passed to service Y. So for that, we will need a property in the analytics service which will decide that what all events will be passed to this particular service. And for that, we can have a property called tracking event, and then we'll need something for initialization that will be our initializers. Now you might notice that in the initializer, we are having the application and the launch option. This is because some of the analytics SDKs require application and the launch options as an input for initialization. So in their documentation, they say that the initialization of our SDK should be the first thing that you should be doing in your did finish launching method from the app delegate, of course. So that is why we are having this kind of initializer. And now from the app delegate, we will call the init method for our analytics manager, which will be of course having the init method because it conforms to the protocol analytics service. And then it will initialize all the SDKs by passing the application and the launch option. So this is how our high-level design looks like. In interviews, when you propose a high-level design to the interviewers, they can ask you to change few things in your proposed design, and then they comes to the implementation part. So in most of the cases, you are asked to implement a particular piece from your design, but in our case, we'll implement the entire design that we have just discussed. So let's go for the implementation part. I'll give you a walkthrough of the code, but you can always access it from the GitHub. The link will be in the description. So let's start. The first entity that we discussed was our analytics manager, and we said that it will be singleton. So here's the shared instance of our analytics manager. The next bit was the methods like send event, set user, unset user, and all those, which will later move to a protocol called analytics service. So let's see that how does analytics service looks like. So here in the analytics service, I am having a method for initialization. This is a protocol, of course. And then we have track user, set user, unset user. And then there's one more property, tracking events, which we discussed towards the end, because we want to control that what all events will be passed to a specific analytics service. So that is why we are having an array over here. And then there are these two extensions. These are just as a helper. So in case any confirming entity does not want to restrict the events that will be passed, they can skip this tracking events part, which will be handled by the default implementation through this extension. And then there's one more extension to decide that whether this event should be tracked or not. We'll see this in a minute. So this is how our analytics service protocol looks like. And then let's move on to the analytics event. So this is the entity that we haven't seen yet, but we are using it. So this is how our analytics event looks like. This analytics event is confirming to the protocol case iterable because I want to return all cases in some of the scenarios. So that is why I'm having this all cases here. And now we have some of the cases. So these are some dummy events that I am using for demonstrating it. There will be a long list of the events in an actual project, but for the demo, these are the three events, that is subscription page viewed, download successful, and download failed. So some of the events can have some data, some parameters associated with them, while some of them will not have them, like subscription page viewed. So these are the three events, and then we are having a name which will describe these events. So a switch on self, which will be returning the string for each of the events, and then a switch on self for deciding the parameters which will be passed with each of these events. Now this will be useful when you will be sending the same string, the same name, and the same set of parameters to each event for each service. But in case this changes depending on the analytics services, then there will be a different way for dealing with it. We'll see it. So this is how our analytics event looks like. Now let's move to the analytics manager part. So we were having a shared instance. Now we are having a services of analytics service. So our different entities will be confirming to the protocol analytics service, and then we'll be having the instance of those analytics services, but with the type analytics services, not the core implementation type. Then there's a method for add. You can call it register, you can call it add, whatever. So this method will be called from app delegate, and whenever you want to add any of the analytics services, it will be as simple as that. Just call this add method from the app delegate and pass the instance. That's it. That instance will be saved in the services, and then that will be used for tracking the events, for setting the properties of user attributes and all those. So this is how the initialization will take place. So this initialize method will be called from the app delegate, and the launch options and the application will be passed as a parameter. And then we will iterate over our array of the services. So for service and services, and then we'll call the initialize method of each of the service. Because our services are confirming to the analytics service protocol, we are sure that it is having this method, that is initialize. So through this, the initialization will take place. And same goes for tracking the event, for setting user and unsetting the user. So the same way we are iterating here for service in services. And then there's case where we want to restrict the events. So some events should be passed to some service while it should be restricted for some others. So for that, we are using a where clause here, that if the service is tracking that particular event, then only call the track event of that particular service. So that is why we had that extension for should track. So if we see it again, in the should track, we are returning that if the tracking events contains this particular event, only then we will be tracking it. So this is how we are restricting it. And then the same goes for set user and unset user. Now let's take a look at the core implementation of our analytics service protocol by one of the examples, let's say CleverTap. So CleverTap is one of the commonly used analytics service providers. And because it is conforming to our analytics service protocol, we are having this initialize method here. And from here, you will be actually calling the method of the SDK for the initialization. So whatever token is to be passed, if launch options are to be passed, or if there's anything else, that will go here. In the track method, we'll be calling the track or the log event or the send event, whatever method the SDK has exposed. So clevertap.share.log event. Same goes for the tracking event. So this is how we are restricting our events that are to be passed. So from here, you can see that we are returning only one event, that is subscription page viewed, which means that we do not want to track the download success and the download failed event through clevertap. So if you see here again in the analytics manager, what we were doing here is that while tracking, we are checking that where service.should_track is having that particular event, if that array contains that event. And that is what we are doing here in the clevertap analytics service, that our tracking events, which is an array, it is having only subscription page viewed. So whenever the download failed event will be tracked, it won't be tracked by the clevertap, because the tracking events array for the clevertap is not having that event. As simple as that. And then again, the set user and unset user goes the same way, that share.set user. Now comes the point that how can we change the event name and the parameters depending on the services. For that, you can write two helper functions in this core implementation itself, say get params and get event name. In those methods, you will just switch over the analytics event, and then you will do whatever the customization is to be done, the way you want to manipulate the data, and then you will send it from there. So before the event actually get tracked, you will change the data. You will call those functions here. For example, let's say get params, and the new params will be passed to the method of the SDK. So this is how you can actually change the data before the event actually gets tracked. And if this is not a requirement, if you don't want this, then we have a default implementation in the event enum itself for the names and for the parameters both. Now the only piece remaining is in the app delegate. So in app delegate, all you need to do is analytics manager.share.add service, and let's say we want to add clevertap analytics service, and then an initialization call. Analytics manager.shared.initialize and pass the application and launch options. That's it. Through these two lines, the clevertap analytics service will be initialized and it will be ready to track the events. And the events that are to be tracked have been already configured. So this approach has been suggested by Fernando Martin, and it is a really good one. There were a few pieces missing for passing the parameters, which I added. So there are some tweaks that I made. But the sole purpose behind this video was to discuss the approach, the thought process that you should have when dealing with a system design interview round. I hope that you found the video helpful, and you can share your thoughts in the comment section. That's pretty much for this video. A new video comes out every weekend, so you can consider subscribing to the channel. Let's write better code together. Happy coding and stay safe.